My name is Nicole, and I will be talking today about Ontario's bat species. So bats are, sorry, I just have to dismiss that. All right, so to start off, what is a bat? Bats are in the class Mammalia, which means that they are warm-blooded and they produce milk to feed their young. And they're in order Chiroptera, which is the order that contains bats. So there's 1,300 species worldwide, which is more than the majority of other orders. They're the second most plentiful order of mammals after Rodentia. So one common misconception about bats is that you may have heard them referred to as flying rats, and they couldn't be further from that. In fact, they're a different order than Carnivora, which is what contains dogs and a lot of our more fuzzy animals that we tend to be drawn to. However, these bats are more closely related to your pet dog than to a rodent. You can also notice that if you look at their teeth, their jaws are very, very similarly shaped to a domestic dog or even a coyote's dentition. So bats have a really broad diet depending on where they live in the world. They are spread throughout the temperate world as well as throughout the tropics, with the highest rates of diversity being focused around the tropics. So we're not really in the highest point of diversity here, but we do have 8 species within Ontario. In Ontario, the majority of our bats are insectivores, which means they eat insects. But some species do also eat fruit, pollen, and nectar, and some will drink blood. They won't bite animals and hunt them out to make these cuts, but usually it's farm animals and they're picking at existing skin sores. And some will even eat small animals, such as typically frogs that would be hunted. So here I have one of the pictures of what I think is probably the most charismatic bat in the New World. That's between North and South America, and that's a northern ghost bat. They're found in Mexico and South America, the northern portion of that. So why are bats important? So first of all, biodiversity is a huge factor. I don't think I need to explain too much about why we ought to value just having as much of a diversity in wildlife as possible. But in addition to their own value as one of many wildlife that call our forests home, they are valuable for insect control. They can help reduce forest pests, specifically spruce bud moth. LDD moth is another issue that we have that's very current right now in terms of invasive species. And many of our bat species really do have a strong preference for moths. So they can be really important members of the ecosystem for helping to maintain the health of our forests. Bats are also pollinators, not so much locally, but they are known to be very active pollinators in South America and also in Africa and some other regions of the tropics, Borneo, Australia. But specifically within North and South America, night blooming cacti are usually the plants that bats are most often associated with, which you can see up in the corner here. And Canadian hoary bats will actually fly to Mexico and have actually been observed pollinating agave, which if anyone likes a margarita, you can thank a hoary bat for your tequila. Finally, for medical research, bats are resilient to a lot of diseases that a lot of other mammals are very susceptible to. So rabies and coronaviruses, which again, very relevant, are very common in bat populations, but they do have a lot higher resilience. And there are a lot of, I'm not sure exactly what research is going on currently, but there has been a lot of research into diseases and how bats actually do manage to stay alive through things that are usually a death sentence for any other animal that catches them. So we have a total of 8 species of bat in Ontario, and I've divided them into 2 slides because they are roughly grouped by behavior and size and a number of other characteristics. And we have these bats that are not at risk in terms of not being listed as endangered. That isn't to say they aren't experiencing population decline, but they haven't been uplisted and are not protected under legislation. They also haven't quite experienced the same level of declines that have warranted the listing of some of the other species. So our 4 species that are not at risk are the hoary bat, Lasiurus cinearis, the eastern red bat, Lasiurus borealis, the silver-haired bat, Lasionycterus noctivagans, and the big brown bat, Ptesicus fuscus. So these bats are larger species in general than our at-risk Myotis species. And 3 out of the 4 of them are actually migratory. So that's these ones. I'm not sure if you can see my cursor, but the 2 on the top, that's hoary bat and eastern red bat, and the very dark one with the little pink earlobes is the silver-haired bat. So those species, as I mentioned earlier, actually migrate south for the winter, which helps to protect them from one of the big risks that a lot of bats are facing, which is white nose syndrome. And they are also the larger bats on the spectrum. And when we get into discussing the vocalizations of bats, these bats are actually a fair bit lower in their tone of vocalization. And they're much more easily identified by echolocations than the Myotis species. Some of these bats, if you don't have any hearing damage, you can actually hear the echolocations very faintly. That's one thing that I've noticed the difference with in the last few years. There definitely comes a point in your life where you stop hearing that sound. All right, so these are our 4 species that are all listed as endangered. And 3 of them are listed as endangered under both the Endangered Species Act, which is our provincial act in Ontario, and the Species at Risk Act, which is federal as well. And then one of the species is only listed provincially. So that is the small-footed Myotis. The small-footed Myotis has a much larger range than some of the other species, so its populations are pretty large in the United States. However, it is quite rare in Canada, so it is it just makes it into Ontario, but it didn't really meet the federal definitions of endangered. So all of these bats are Myotis species, so they are all of the same genus and quite closely related. These are very, very small bats, and they have extremely high vocalizations, which helps to identify them. Unfortunately, because their vocalizations are so brief and so high, a lot of them very much, when you're analyzing them, unless they are right next to the microphone, it's very hard to determine which one it is. But there are some characteristics that help to determine these. particularly the tricolored bat, which you'll notice is Perimyotis subflavus. So this one is a little bit further removed from the other three genetically, and it has a slightly lower call range. So these bats are all hibernators, and they also have slightly different habits in terms of where they prefer to roost throughout the summer. So small-footed Myotis is very much known for preferring rocky areas and very tight crevices. It's often found behind people's doors and screens, as well as under rocks and in very narrow fissures. It also will hibernate in smaller areas than the other bats. The little brown bat is the endangered bat that would most often be associated with an attic, as well as the big brown bat. Both of those bats have very similar habitat requirements and are often found next to each other. However, the little brown bat has been more severely impacted by white nose syndrome. Northern long-eared bat is very much a forest bat. So they are typically found in larger areas of forest and aren't as commonly found using human-made structures, very similar to tricolored bat, Perimyotis subflavus, another forest species. And these bats will also use shaggy bark, particularly if you think of a shagbark hickory, that peeling bark is perfect to just hide behind. And they'll also use dried leaf clusters to roost throughout the daytime. All right, so life history is kind of where we start to get into the bat walks that we'll be doing over the next couple of weeks. So essentially in the autumn, the bat active season runs from April 1st to September 30th, roughly. And in between that time, in October, bats are congregating at their hibernation sites or beginning to swarm for migration. And they will do generally group migrations or group movements towards their hibernacula. So this is where mating occurs, and it's a very social interaction with bats. Again, bats are not the most thoroughly studied species, so we are still learning a lot about their behaviors, and swarming in particular is one that there's so much, there's more questions than there are answers. But we do know that essentially these large social congregations of bats form. They mate at some point, and the females actually delay fertilization until the spring, where they actually become pregnant rather than becoming pregnant immediately after mating. So after they mate and swarm, they either move into hibernation or into migration. And that occurs from roughly November to March. Bats will often be at their hibernation sites before then and not roosting in trees necessarily, but they actually, once the temperatures get cold, stop exiting the caves or other structures. And in the spring, approximately around April 1st, but as we were discussing before beginning today, this is a colder year than we had last year, so we're expecting slightly later emergence than we would necessarily have had last year, where we had already had temperatures above 20 degrees. And after spring emergence, essentially females and males split, and you'll have the pregnant females looking for a roost tree that's a suitable maternity roost to raise their young. And male bats or females who are not pregnant will generally be a lot more solitary. They'll roost in smaller groups, but they don't really congregate in the same numbers, and they have a lot more mobility throughout the season. Maternity roosting is the season that is the most critical to bat survival, apart from hibernation. And that season, the mother bats, basically, they give birth and they leave their pups in a tree whenever they go out to forage at night. So typically, pups are about a third of the size of the female bat when they're born. So their weight ratio to the female bat is quite restrictive. So they are able to move roosts, but they generally prefer to be able to stay put because it is quite a lot of mass to be carrying. So it takes pups about 3 weeks, 3 to 4 weeks to be able to fly, and they are weaned shortly after that. So the maternity roosting season typically ends in early July, depending on when they actually gave birth. And then we move into a transient roosting period where bats become a lot more mobile. And again, we're not really sure exactly what's going on in that period, but they are moving around and using trees and other roosts. And there has been some evidence that bats will actually travel very large distances in this time, and that there may be sites that they visit repeatedly year to year. Bats can also live into their 30s. We're not sure what the upper limit is, but the oldest bat that has been captured was over 30 years old. And she was re-tagged in a colony here in Ontario by the same researcher 30 years apart. So essentially, there is a huge potential for social interactions and these bats to be going from site to site. In a recent presentation that I attended, apparently bats were essentially visiting one site, and the same 2-day period, year to year, the same bats would be there. But if you miss that period in that single year, they've moved on somewhere else. So the exact rationale for where they're moving and why they're moving isn't quite clear, but I'm really excited to see what further knowledge we end up learning over the next few years, because bats have been getting a lot more attention, and that's really key to being able to actually learn about them and research them a bit further. So we briefly discussed the 2 different kinds of winter behavior. So hibernation is one of the critical life history times for our species at-risk bats, and hibernation habitat is protected under both the Endangered Species Act and the Species at-Risk Act. These sites are very rare typically, and they are usually very well used and repeatedly visited by bats. There will often be more than one species within each hibernacula, and depending on the bat, they might be in different portions of the cave. So typically, these bats hibernate either in caves or abandoned mines. Specifically in the Ottawa area, there are a number of caves in Gatineau Park that are known to support bat hibernacula, as well as a couple of mines near Renfrew. Some bats also overwinter in attics and other buildings. Anything that has enough heat to remain approximately around 4 degrees throughout the winter is the ideal temperature. And essentially, you can find them in quite a lot of urban environments associated with human-made structures. You can also occasionally find particularly small-footed bats in very deep crevices in bedrock. Anything that essentially goes beyond the point of frost and doesn't go into the groundwater level is kind of considered the life zone. So similar to snakes, they can make use of very small spaces as long as the proper temperatures are available. So white nose syndrome is a fungus that is, it's an invasive introduced fungus that grows in caves, and moist, dark, damp environments is where it thrives, and that's typically where these bats are spending a very large portion of their year. So this is one of the main threats that has impacted these bats in disproportionate numbers to our migratory species. So in terms of migration, we have three species: the eastern red bat, the hoary bat, and the silver-haired bat. The eastern red bat and the silver-haired bat typically fly along the Atlantic flyway. They often share the same flyways as birds. So they'll often fly to the Carolinas or down towards Florida for the winter. They have both been observed sleeping or overwintering in leaf litter a little bit further south. So within the Carolinas, where it doesn't get quite as cold as it does here. But at least this far north, they do seek warmer temperatures. Hoary bats have one of the broadest ranges of bats in North America, and they typically overwinter in Mexico. So in terms of maternity behavior, that is our other key life period for bats. One of the reasons that bats are so slow to recover their populations is because they typically only have one pup per year. The Myotis species, the smaller species, typically only have one, whereas a couple of our larger species are able to have twins or occasionally triplets as well. So as I mentioned earlier, they experience delayed fertilization, which is a strategy that a lot of mammals, especially those that hibernate, use. And the pups are born in late May to early June. Again, about a third of the size of the female bat, which is a little bit horrifying to think about. And they're able to fly at 3 to 4 weeks of age and are weaned shortly thereafter. Typically, they stay in the roost while the mothers forage at night, and they're usually in large collective roosts where you may have very many groups of females that are raising their young within the same tree or attic. So right here we have a picture of a nursing eastern red bat, and she has 2 pups. So eastern red bats typically have twins, which helps their population numbers. Hoary bats are the largest, and they're the ones that are most common to have triplets. So as I mentioned, bat trees are really important to maternity roost habitat. Maternity roost habitat is protected provincially, not federally. However, if they add that to the definition of critical habitat, it may become protected in the future. So essentially, when we're looking at maternity roost trees, we're looking for very specific categories of trees, typically located within forests that have a high density of cavity trees. And there's a strong preference for large growing native canopy trees. Some of the best species for them are red maple, sugar maple, basswood, red oak, American beech, shagbark hickory, and white pine. Willows are also really excellent. I don't know if they're as ideal for maternity roosts, but they are really great for isolated bats and independent roosting, particularly if they're trying to find a good day roost close to a water body. So typically, ideal maternity roost trees are the larger the better. So 25 centimeters around at breast height is the lower end of the size spectrum that we're looking at. Additionally, higher cavities are better than lower ones for safety reasons. There is the potential for predation from squirrels, minks, raccoons, and other animals. Owls are also predators that do attack bats. So typically, there is a strong preference for cavities that are located a bit higher up in the tree that lead down into a hollow, as well as things that are on straighter trees and don't really have a low, large access point for something like a raccoon to get in and disturb them. So peeling bark and dry leaf clusters are also beneficial, but those are primarily for independent and solitary bats, male bats and non-breeding females, whereas there is a very strong correlation between cavity trees and these maternity roosts that we're aiming to protect. And in addition, one of the things with cavity trees that is worth noting is that they are typically better in forested habitat. They are pretty rare in the urban area because the tree species that we plant throughout cities tend to not form cavities quite as readily as some of these species. Red maple in particular tends to be a swamp tree, and it forms really beautiful cavities when it's grown in the wild in the forest. But when it's in the city, it tends to be a little bit more maintained, both for human safety reasons as well as aesthetics. So we don't tend to have as good quality of cavity habitat in urban areas. So typically you'll find bats, especially when they're maternity roosting within an urban area, tend to be associated with a human-made structure. Bat boxes actually do have quite good uptake, particularly in suburban areas where there is a lot of forest fragments very nearby. Additionally, forest-grown trees tend to be taller before the canopy branches out. So that helps to create a good habitat where you don't essentially have a ladder for raccoons to walk up quite as easily. So when we're looking for bats, there are a few ways that we can go about it. So essentially, identifying bat habitat and identifying the bats themselves are sort of two separate steps of bat research. So typically, if we're looking for potential habitat, it's structures or cavity trees that we are looking at. So with structures, it's basically inspecting human-made structures for suitable crevices. Only an inch long is a suitable crevice. So if you find bridges that have the right angle on the sun, they'll tend to squeeze into little cracks and crevices. So essentially, that's a two-step process, looking for the crevices and then looking for any signs of bats. So that's typically guano. Bats are very messy. So if bats are using a place, their feces and urine stains are usually spread over the walls, vertical surfaces of the area. They very much poop and fly. So there is definitely a very messy trail left behind, especially if there are large numbers of bats. Additionally, you can often find moths or other insects that look like they have a bite taken out of them. Moths missing their body and just like a couple of wings with a little bite mark taken out of them is a pretty common thing to find under bridges that are being used by bats. The other type of habitat that we would be looking for bats in is cavity trees. So that would be doing a cavity tree density survey and establishing essentially whether there are enough cavity trees within a woodlot of a suitable size that would be able to support bats. So typically we do this when there is leaf-off condition, and we can use binoculars to see right up into the top of the canopies. Because it is those really tall canopy trees and the really high cavities that are providing some of the best habitat. So Carlington Woods and Hampton Woods both have some really great cavity trees. So I'm really excited to get out and hear if there's many bats using them yet. So once we've looked and determined where there is some bat habitat, there are two ways to essentially determine whether bats are actually there. That is exit surveys and acoustic surveys. Exit surveys, you're simply looking for bats actually leaving the structure. And that would basically involve setting up some lights in front of the structure and inspecting it before dusk. And I've had some fun experiences seeing bats emerge around dusk. Typically trees, I haven't seen any large colonies, but willow trees above rivers tend to be really good locations, at least for my experience. Active acoustic monitoring is more active, as the name implies. You're actually going and moving around with the acoustic monitor, and we're basically using a microphone to record echolocation, which is how bats hunt for their prey. So active acoustic monitoring, you can focus on a specific emergence site while you're looking for bats and use a microphone to capture recordings. That way you can identify which species you're seeing. Or you can do a general transect through a forest, which is what we will be doing to look for bats within Carlington and Hampton Forest. Another option, which is how bat critical habitat is determined, is passive acoustic monitoring. And that is typically done during the maternity roosting season. And detectors are installed near suitable trees for 10 days is the minimum to establish presence or absence of maternity roost colonies. And this would be for forested habitats that meet the minimum size threshold and meet minimum cavity densities. So typically denser, more rural forested habitats, and a monitor is installed with the microphone facing into a small clearing so that the bats are ideally vocalizing as they're flying past. In going through this data, one thing that I have found is that a lot of bats do fly into microphones. They also fly into branches quite often. But there is, I have seen some echolocations where you have a clear echolocation space and it's getting louder and louder, and then the entire screen just turns red with the well, the combination of the frequency and the strength of the sound that the microphone's picking up. And the only way I can interpret that is the bat hitting the microphone. I've also seen bats fly into branches during exit surveys as well. They're clumsier than we would expect, but they do recover very gracefully, as you would hope. So acoustic monitoring is the main thing that we do to identify bat species. So essentially, you're using an ultrasonic microphone that can record bats' echolocations that picks up on sounds that we can't hear with the human ear. Each species has a unique signature, and specialized software has been created to help us identify calls by comparing them to a known library of species. The software that we'll be using for the bat box over the next few weeks is called Echometer Pro, and it's by Wildlife Acoustics. They also make a Kaleidoscope, which is a sound analysis software that can be used for birds, bats, amphibians. Some people have also adapted it to mammals. So typically, species at risk bats are smaller and they call at higher frequencies than larger species. So we're looking, when we're looking for species at risk, it's above 40 kilohertz and typically between 40 and 100 kilohertz that you'll have your call. Unfortunately, the higher the kilohertz, the fainter the sound. So sometimes we will lose that upper register in terms of the visual representation of the call that comes back. But typically you look at the average calls and you will see, for example, here we have 2 different bat species, and this here we can see that the intensity of the call is much greater than these. So you can tell that the bat is getting closer to the microphone. So these calls are all between 15 and approximately 30 kilohertz. They do edge over, but those are also known as harmonics. So sometimes there are 2 registers that are being vocalized at the same time by the same bat. So this one here, we have the higher bat that's calling more faintly in the distance here is a big brown bat. And the lower one, I believe that one is a hoary bat. They're typically the lowest vocalizers with the deepest voices. This call here is above 40 kilohertz, and it has the typical shape of a meiotis call, which tends to be a very elongated curve with a slight tail at the end. So because of the difference in the intensity of vocalizations, while we can rely on the software, we need to do manual verification to actually confirm which calls are quieter that might not necessarily get picked up by the auto ID software. So I have spent a couple of summers going through thousands of bat calls looking for anything that's hidden in the background. And I have to say that the majority of the species at risk bats that I have found recordings of, I've found them only through that manual verification process, and they would not have been picked up otherwise. So we've talked a lot about bats, and now I'm going to kind of move into what is happening with bats in Ontario and what we can do at home to support them. And then we'll kind of move back towards the monitoring and talk about what we'll be doing over the next couple of weeks. So threats to bats in Ontario, the largest one is white nose syndrome, which is a fungus that was, they believe it was introduced by spelunkers, which is a fancy name for cave, essentially cave hiking and climbing within caves. So it would have been brought over on equipment that had been used in a cave in Europe where this fungus has been found previously. And it is something that is very much a risk here in the Ottawa area. So if you do go into caves, particularly hikes in Gatineau Park, it's worth washing your boots or any gear that you bring in with you with a little bit of diluted bleach. My hiking boots are a bit of a wreck because I clean them with bleach very often. And essentially, we do have a few caves in Ontario that are well known and do have a lot of human visits that do have white nose. So for example, Warsaw Caves near Peterborough has known white nose, and I know there is a fair amount of white nose in the Ottawa area, but I'm not sure specifically which caves have it confirmed. I find the safest bet is to just assume that it's on you and wash everything. So some of the colonies within Renfrew, particularly abandoned mine in Renfrew, have had 99% decline of the number of bats that are overwintering them there. There has been some improvement in recent years, and numbers are growing again. But it is still very much a risk that is having a huge impact on populations across Canada. Habitat loss is another huge issue because maternity roost habitat is very important to the survival of the next generation of bats. So cavity trees within forests and swamps tend to be a little bit less valued than other trees, and they take a long time to develop, which is something that can be a bit of a concern as we move into a more urban and human-focused environment. Light pollution, noise pollution can also be issues. However, the exact effects of this haven't been very thoroughly studied. Collisions with wind turbines and vehicles are also issues. Wind turbines especially attract insects. So the moths, as we know, moths love light. So the bright white color of wind turbines ends up attracting a cluster of moths, and the bats will often get hit or pulled into a vacuum behind the turbines as they're foraging. Insecticide use is also a huge issue because that is, of course, affecting their food source. And any insecticides that are able to actually persist in insect populations before it actually kills them can affect bats as well. So they have such small body masses that it doesn't take a lot of a toxin to be able to damage them. They also have very low population recovery rates, specifically our species at risk populations, because they typically only have one pup per year. So if you think about an animal that lives to be about 30 or more years old, they're only reproducing once per year. There's a huge amount of energy that is going into each pup. And the longevity of that pup is really important, and actually being able to support bats throughout their lives, because rather than being able to really quickly recover their populations, their value towards the population recovery really increases over their lifespan. So how can we help bats at home? So in the urban area, what we can do is somewhat limited, but bat houses do have relatively good uptake. Canadian Wildlife Federation did some surveys in the Canada area, and they ended up having something like 70% occupation rates within 1 year. So of course, a bit of this is location and knowing that the bats are around. So there was definitely a well-established bat population in the area that took to these really quickly. So success rates aren't typically that high closer into the city, but they do help. So the main resources that I would recommend for anyone who's looking at putting up a bat box is either Canadian Wildlife Federation. Again, they're based here in Canada, so there's a lot of resources, and sometimes they do have fundraisers where they sell the boxes themselves, but they have plans that you can print out for free and build your own. AlbertaBats.ca is also a really great resource, and they have a lot of information on the different kinds of bat houses and different things that you can do to make them more attractive. So typically they need to be about I didn't put in how high they need to be, but they need to typically be 12 feet high at minimum. And the higher is better. And this picture here shows off a really good structure because we have a really sturdy pole that is relatively straight. So you're not going to have a lot of potential for predators to climb up that pole and to use that structure. In addition, this bat house is really well placed. It's in a sunny location, so it is going to get some very direct sun throughout the day. Bats like it to be very, very warm. even despite our warming temperatures in June and July, they do generally prefer a very high temperature environment. So boxes that are painted either black or dark brown tend to absorb more heat. They also do have a strong preference for multi-chambered boxes, so they can actually move from one area to another, depending on the temperature at the time of the day. And non-maternity roosting bats will actually move roosts in the middle of the day, which is a little bit surprising, but it's not uncommon to see bats flying around in the middle of the day, especially between 10 and 11 a.m. seems to be a sweet spot where the sun angle is changing, so they're moving to somewhere a little bit warmer. So again, there is a risk of placing these in locations that might have higher access by predators. So it's really important if you are putting up a bat house to make sure that you're not increasing the risk to any animals that might use it. Installing bat houses is also a really great alternative if you already have bats in your attic and you're looking to exclude them. It's always best to give them an alternative habitat before you actually make the structure unsuitable for them. So another way you can help bats if you have bat encounters. So generally, if you find a bat in your home, it's very important to always handle with gloves, preferably some thick work gloves, because they do have very small, very sharp teeth that can puncture even if it feels like they're barely touching you. Bats are transmitters of rabies. So if you are handling a bat, you absolutely need to be wearing gloves. And if there is any chance that you've been bitten, seek medical attention right away. Doctors can basically give you a rabies vaccine after being bitten, and it's relatively straightforward, but you do need to make that visit pretty quickly. If you find a bat in the winter, it will always need help. Essentially, it is outside of its hibernacula. It probably has white nose syndrome, which is a main reason that bats wake up in the middle of the winter. So if you do find one in the winter, place it in a dark box with some air holes and a towel. No food, no water, and call your local wildlife rescue. Rideau Valley Wildlife is a great resource, and basically get transported there relatively quickly. You want to keep it somewhere that is cool, but not cold. So something that is going to be above freezing temperature, but a basement is an ideal place to keep it, somewhere away from pets as well. And if you find a healthy bat in your home, which does occasionally happen, it's best to capture it with a towel, especially if it's flying around. A light towel just tossed over it is the easiest way. That's also a great way to catch birds if they end up in your house, or if you have to catch an injured bird that's hit a window for any reason. Typically, bats can move around in the daytime, as I mentioned, but often if they're comfortable, they'll just stay in a nice dark area for the daytime. So if you can keep it away from pets and put it somewhere safe, and then leave the box propped open near dusk, somewhere, again, safe and away from pets, not near your cat's favorite, your neighbor's cat's favorite outdoor chair, because I certainly hope that everyone keeps their cats inside. And usually they'll fly away by morning. So if you do have bats living in your home, it's really important to seek help from a wildlife professional to get advice on safe and ethical exclusion. Most of these wildlife control companies do have a really good understanding of how bats need to be excluded for, and essentially they don't do exclusion during the maternity roosting season. because you don't want to separate mothers from their pups. But in the later portion of the year or very early in the year, basically some mesh can be placed so that the bats can get out but can't get back in. So ideally, if you have a bat house set up, they can simply make the transition over. All right, so another thing you can do is citizen science. So what we'll be doing for the next month, we are at the official start of the bat active season. Temperatures right now are still a little bit low, but hopefully by next week we'll be getting into the point of emergence and starting to hear some of the bats that have been hibernating locally, waking up and moving around. And we might get to figure out exactly when in the month the migratory bats start to arrive back. I have done a little bit of monitoring for fun in Carlington Woods, and I was primarily getting big brown bat and silver-haired bat. So those are the two species that I expect to hear the most of. There are definitely hoary bats around, and I wouldn't be surprised to find some little brown bats. But I'm not sure that we can be confident that those will be picked up on the microphone too easily. So essentially at 8:30 on Friday nights, alternating between Carlington Park and Hampton Park, we will be meeting and taking a short walk to do a transect. So we'll be using the Echo Meter microphone. So this will be attached to an iPhone, and it's able to record bat calls. And what we'll see is very similar to what's shown on the screen here, where in real time you will visually see the representation of the bat's vocalization. So these are from Wildlife Acoustics. They run around $200. So they are something that if you are really eager and interested in bats, they're a very fun thing to have, especially if you have bats near your home, or if you like to, I often bring it with me when I'm going camping so that I can see what bats are around in different forest locations. Just a reminder that it is the still very early in the year, so dress for the weather. It will be dropping in temperature pretty dramatically from the time we start to the time we end. And bring a flashlight or a headlamp. We'll generally be sticking to the main trails, but we might take some of the major unpaved trails as well. One feature that I'm really excited to see at Carlington Woods, if everyone's familiar with the area, there is the city's snow management, almost like a quarry. And recently someone, sorry?
It's called the City Yard. It's the former quarry. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. So the city yard and those steep cliffs. I have, since I moved to this area, I've had a hunch that there might be some particularly good crevices for hibernation in that area. And a dog walker recently found a dead bat in January in the snow very close to there. So typically there weren't really any houses nearby with that location. So I wouldn't typically expect an attic bat to have made it that far. So we might be able to get some very early observations and get a little bit of information on what species it might be. That's also something that there is potential. I know the salt towers or the salt sheds that the city has are really often used by barn swallows, so they may also provide bat habitat. Either way, it should be interesting. And that is everything. thank you everyone for listening and for your interest in bats. And if anyone has any questions.
Yeah, no, that was great. And while people are thinking possibly about their questions, if they want to ask it, Sean, go right ahead. You've got your hand up.
Oh, I was clapping, but I can
Oh,
have my
oh,
hand up.
pardon me. I thought you had your hand up.
I have both. I have both. White nose syndrome, how big a problem is it in this area? Does the 99% apply here too?
Yeah, so the Renfrew, the 99% is based on a specific hibernacula in Renfrew. So that would apply to the Ottawa area as well.
Okay. And
typically bats can range over 300 kilometers. So it is something that can be very, very widespread.
Thanks. And bat houses, are there any, I thought it'd be fun to maybe get one, but if they do have rabies in their dogs, those don't seem to go very well together. So how do you, any advice around that?
Well, it's one of those things that it's not guaranteed that they have rabies. It's just that they don't exhibit obvious signs of rabies like other animals would. So there is a very highly precautionary approach when it comes to rabies in bats. Generally, if your bat house is placed really high up, that's something that hopefully your dogs and the bats would never interact, but it is something that is definitely a worthwhile concern. So maybe considering somewhere that your dogs don't necessarily have access to directly below the roost would probably be my top tip.
And yay, women looking after their own reproduction system there, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so we've got a couple of extra questions. I've got one. When bats migrate, do they fly during the day? And I think you said they kind of do sometimes, but.
So that's an interesting question. Migration is not the most well-established behavior as well. I have done surveys for bats migrating in the evening. So evening does seem to be the peak time. However, there are some historical records, like over 100 years ago, of large swarms of bats migrating in the daytime. There haven't been any recent reports of that though.
Yeah. And what is the size difference between a little and a big brown bat?
I have notes. So
I don't think it's a huge difference, right?
It is. So the little brown bat weighs between 4 and 11 grams.
Wow. So that's like 2 teaspoons of sugar.
And the big brown bat is 10 to 21 grams.
Okay.
So
all right. So that's
a
a big
double
size difference. Wow.
Yeah, one's 2 times as much.
Yeah.
Yeah, and to kind of put things into perspective as well, the hoary bat ranges from 8 to 39 grams. So it's twice the size essentially of a big brown bat.
Okay. Now, did they migrate individually or did they do it in groups?
Typically in groups.
Yeah. Okay. All right. A couple more coming in here. Let's see, what's the habitat range for an individual bat? So how big of a space is there, is there living space sort of thing? Like, are there ones that maybe live their entire lives in Hampton?
So they would, they do seem to have much larger ranges. Again, I don't have exact knowledge of how large their individual ranges are, but again, bats are often recorded traveling over 300 kilometers from summer habitat to a hibernacula site. Some will travel 100 kilometers. And there also have been reports of bats actually visiting multiple hibernacula sites before the weather actually changes. There was a bat that was recorded near Lake Ontario that was picked up near Thunder Bay a couple of weeks later.
Wow. Heather, why don't you go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question while I'm looking at some of the other ones in the chat.
Thank you. So my question is about the protected species, because you said it's provincial and that makes sense. But what kind of obligation does the city have like in the bats that are here, and it sounds like the work to do that is done by you, and not really, like if you're not providing this for them to prove that these bats are here, they're just not, it's not going to be taken into consideration.
So typically, bats, critical bat habitat is typically forest-based. So within the city, there is generally protection to tree removal periods, very similar to the breeding births. That applies specifically to the active season. So that is regulated under MECP. And essentially no removal of cavity trees between April 1st and September 30th, unless surveys have been done or unless there is a very valid reason for it being a hazard tree that needs to be removed a bit more rapidly.
Okay, so just, I don't want to get into too much, but what's going on at the Queen Juliana Park? Like, I don't know about the bats there specifically, but this seems to be, we're starting to fall into that range. And is the city doing proactive?
I can't comment on that. I'm sorry.
No.
Yeah.
Like as a policy, we don't know that the city isn't proactively have a policy,
The city does have a policy.
but whether
And-
it's being implemented.
The city does have a policy and it has been implemented, but I can't comment any further. I'm sorry.
Okay, that's fair. Thank you.
Okay, just a couple more from the chat here. Somebody had said, do you typically see bats on the walk in addition to hearing and detecting them? As you said, it might be tricky in April, but certainly
So-
I saw them in May and June.
Yeah, I do find that you do often see them. Once you start getting the echo meter sort of shows you, and you usually see a couple of blips, and then usually as soon as we see that, I'll give you a flag and we can look usually near the open clearings above the pathway is ideal, as well as under street lights, which is usually really easy to see.
Okay. And a quick question about the bat houses. Now, do you have to clean them every year? Would you have to take them down, clean them out?
That's actually a good question. I've never actually maintained a bat house myself. I don't believe they need as much maintenance as bird houses do.
Okay.
But it would probably be a good proactive strategy to just regularly maintain them.
Yeah.
Annually, I wouldn't expect as necessarily, but every couple of years.
Yeah, but a
just
good
to make sure
research.
they're in good shape.
Yeah, good research topic perhaps for someone.
Yeah.
Nora, why don't you go ahead and ask your question?
Yeah. So, well, oh, now I forget. Oh, I remember one of them, but there's a stormwater pond not too far from Carlington Woods. It's kind of actually along, there's a bit of a corridor, you might say, between it and the woods.
Yeah,
where there are trees. Do you know the one I'm talking about?
I do. It's in Central Park with that linear park connecting the two.
Yes, and it's got a few large willow trees there, and it just occurred to me. I wondered if there might be, bats in there.
Yeah, because that isn't necessarily a closed canopy forest area, I wouldn't expect to find maternity roosting habitat, but individual bats for sure. Willow trees have been where I've had the most luck finding individual bats, specifically around stormwater management ponds. So that would actually be one of the nights if we have a bit of extra time, we can loop around that area.
Oh, that'd be interesting. Yeah. Okay, thanks.
Yeah, you had mentioned the bit about the quarry, and that's what I'm interested in, because I think that's a really good, there must be some really good crevices. And I know certainly ravens are in there, and there's foxes, there's some wildlife that kicks around in that whole area. So
Yeah, and I know there's a snake that must hibernate in that area too. So typically if there's snake hibernacula, you know,
Okay.
there's at least some crevices that go deep enough.
Yeah, because we've definitely, there's been, I think, milk snake spottings for sure. There's garter snakes. And I think somebody even got a grass snake photograph one year.
Oh, they're
Yeah,
wonderful.
like the really bright green ones. So yeah, somebody else, what species of bat is Batman? Well, he was an Adam Westus. And let's see, the photo that you've got on screen, so that's an eastern red, right?
Yes, and
And so they sleep, I guess, upstairs or in trees rather. This guy's asleep.
yeah, so eastern red bats, I don't typically find them in the city. They are very much large forests. So I've heard them out near Renfrew, and I've also seen pictures in Gatineau Park of eastern reds.
Yeah, okay. Oh, thank you, Lindsay. Lindsay's posted a bit of information about the cleaning of the bat boxes.
Wow.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I had a question about that because the ones that have the twins and the triplets now, did they do it as a, you know, as a lot of species do, they have a, you know, like an heir and a spare, right? They have some extras. What's the survival rate of the twins or the triplets? You know, like, do they all survive or?
That's a good question. I'm not actually sure of the answer to it.
Yeah.
It would probably make a really great PhD project. But typically they do put a lot of maternal care into their young. So I don't think it's quite the same sort of fatality rates that you see with
Okay.
a lot of species that breed a little bit more rapidly.
Right. And what are some of the top animals then that are predators? You'd mentioned a few, some of the bigger, you know, the owls, probably some of the larger raptors. Are there like raccoons? What about foxes? Would they even, you know, like, I don't even think foxes would.
Foxes would probably have a pretty hard time getting
Yeah,
access
getting
to
them.
bats. Historically, I would have expected there might be potential for gray foxes to have had a bit more ability to predate on bats because they are tree climbing. But I would expect primarily mustelids, so weasels, minks, pine martens,
Possibly
cats.
cats. He's an indoor
Yeah.
cat.
Well,
Yeah,
sorry, specifically, I would say cats in the urban area.
yeah. And squirrels are also really aggressive predators. It's something that surprises a lot of people, but both birds and bats are often impacted by squirrels who have that agility to actually get up into those cavities.
What if your pet were to eat a bat? Would it be, you know, like just good idea, call your vet?
Oh yeah, I would.
Yeah,
I
okay.
would absolutely call my vet if that
Well,
happened.
because somebody had asked, are bats safe to eat for predators? But it's just like, well, if a cat or a dog, maybe the main predator, then yeah, take it to the vet.
And of course, if your animal is up to date on their rabies shots, it is a lot of it is preventative. So then they just get the preventative vaccine. Usually it's a 2 vaccine portions. So
yeah.
for example, I have my rabies vaccine, but if I were bitten by a bat, I would still need to have those boosters to make sure that nothing happened.
And you don't get them in the stomach anymore, right? If you ever did. Was that a myth?
I'm not sure about the ones that you actually get after being bitten, but the initial vaccine was just in the arm. It wasn't.
Okay.
Wasn't
I always remember that from as a kid. People said, "Oh, you have to get them in the stomach, and it really hurts." And it's just like, okay, well, I guess I'll stay away from rabies. You know?
Yeah, I think it's a little bit better now.
Yeah, yeah. One question I sort of had was, you know, like, and I'm, you know, like beyond the city and, you know, whatever they're doing, there are areas you talked about Renfrew, are there areas that are being more impacted in Ottawa than others from a habitat loss? Like where even if we don't know for sure there were bat populations, probably a good chance that there were. I'm just thinking like along the LRT lines or something, you know, like the bigger projects like that.
Yeah, so I know the LRT did do some mitigation for bats. So for me, I'm really looking at swamp habitat because it has those large red maple trees in particular that the best cavity trees that I've seen in forests tend to be red maples because they do have wet roots, so they get enough decay, but they're still a very healthy and happy tree.
Yeah.
So that again is very much the edges of the city. So Canada jumps out as an area with really rapid development, where we are losing forests again further south. So part of that as well, there is the larger development side of things, but there is also the ability that if you do live towards the edges of the city, there's a lot of opportunity to conserve cavity trees and maintain your trees in a way that helps to support natural growth rather than necessarily keeping them quite as manicured as you would ideally, well, if they're located really close to your house or your car.
Right. Nora, you had another question?
Yeah, I actually had two. One I put in the chat, but I'll ask it. It was about whether it might be worth digging some holes or some like cavities into the walls of the quarry. You know, like if there was a way to do that, if you could help to increase habitat that way.
The challenge with that is that we are on sedimentary bedrock, so there is a lot of potential for that to cause larger chain reactions. And ideally, you don't want to have something that's too open to the elements. So those natural crevices that are really small are probably going to be better than anything that we could create intentionally, at least in a rock face.
Right. Okay. Makes sense.
Well,
My other question was,
Although I'm not a blasting specialist, so
yeah,
they might be a little more artful with the dynamite than I expect.
yeah. The other question was, I just sort of started wondering how do cavities get created in trees?
So
Should somehow
one of, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I just sort of wondering why I don't know that, but anyways.
There's definitely a wide variety of reasons that cavities can form. Compartmentalization of decay, for anyone who's taken some tree biology, that's kind of your go-to for a lot of the larger cavities. So essentially trees can form a seal around injuries. So you'll actually get decay behind this wall. So something like a broken branch that gets infected with some fungus will actually rot out, but the tree will just create this sort of protective layer around it. And usually the decay spreads up and down more easily than it spreads out. So you will sometimes get these really long cavities in trees from a relatively old injury. And then sometimes you'll have a break that will cause an opening higher up, even if the tree has sealed it off completely. We also have our friends like the pileated woodpecker, which is definitely doing strong work in Carlington Woods. I'm not sure about Hampton, but
Yeah.
the woodpeckers are really helpful for creating good quality bat habitat, and no one does it better than the pileated.
I had a question related to that because I was recently in Carlington with a bunch of youngsters, and they were tapping the cedar trees, and a lot of them that have the holes in them, they're completely hollow, almost completely up and down. Would they be cavity trees? Because I know that wasn't a species that was on necessarily your sort of hit list with those, but would they be a good one?
Potentially, and the cedar trees in Carlington are huge comparatively to what you'd typically find. So they're kind of left off of the main list because they usually don't reach sufficient
Okay.
sizes, but I wouldn't be surprised to find them.
I thought maybe BC cedars, right? Because BC, you associate the larger cedars with the western cedars, right? Not the eastern.
Mhm.
So I thought maybe there might be some, some of that on the west coast.
Yeah, I'm not too sure about West Coast bat species,
Yeah.
but that's definitely a possibility.
Yeah.
I do know that the better cavities do tend to be, at least for Ontario, do tend to be associated with deciduous trees.
Okay.
But we do have a handful, red pine, for example,
Mhm.
and white pine create
Yeah.
pretty nice cavities. But
Okay.
yeah, that is definitely an interesting thing to think about.
Yeah.
In about the cedars in the Westboro region, there are quite a number of old cedar hedges, and I mean old, like 40, 50 years plus, that are a good 30, 40 feet high, and there are bat populations in those.
Hmm.
Um, sometimes when the new development's coming and they rip out the old cedar hedges. I mean, that's destruction of habitat. But I do know that in a couple of places I've lived, there have been bats in the fairly dense old cedar hedges. Not the recently planted ones, but the ones that were original to the neighborhood.
Okay, and that would typically be, I would expect that to be independent bats that are solitary. So male bats are non-productive females typically, because the cover and the cover that's typically required for maternity roosting wouldn't really be found within a hedge, but you would have a lot of good leafy cover for these bats that are roosting a little bit more solitarily.
Okay, that's interesting. Thank
Yeah,
you.
so like the picture of the eastern red bat here, they love a dense leafy habitat. So it would probably be similar species to that, and hoary bats or silver haired that would make use of that kind of a habitat.
Well, mostly the bats in this neighborhood are the not the little brown bats, the big brown bats.
Yeah, and most big brown bats don't tend to be tree roosters or leaf roosters as much. They are very much they're very much an attic species. Like they've really adapted to artificial habitats, which is part of the reason that we're so able to find them in urban areas.
Mhm.
Somebody asked about Britannia. You mentioned swamps because it's so close to Mud Lake, Britannia Park. Would that be, somebody was asking, would that might be a good place to look as well?
Oh, for sure.
Yeah.
It's the bats are relatively widespread. So when you find these like little sweet spots of habitat, just around dusk or a bit later, usually if you're looking for visibility closer to dusk, it's a little bit better. And if you're looking to listen or record, later is better. But solitary bats are usually visible throughout the entire year. So Britannia would probably be really good for being able to see some of those, the independent male bats throughout this part of the year, particularly also in the maternity roosting season. You'd be getting mostly male bats there.
Okay.
Moving into October, when they start to migrate or move towards roost sites, I would expect to see larger numbers in that area because it is so close to the Ottawa River.
Mhm.
And migration pathways often follow water courses, almost like highways. So that would probably be a really great spot later in the year.
Yeah. Well, anybody who grew up in this neck of the woods, the Royal Ottawa Hospital just past Westgate used to have a brick incinerator, and it had stopped using it. I don't remember when, but I remember seeing bats emerge from that, you know, most nights in the summertime. And my sister and I would get onto our little roof of our garage and we would whistle for them, and we would always see the bats coming around. So yeah, I don't know if the whistling actually attracted them, but we thought it did. So
it's definitely one of those things that they're really resourceful at finding these habitats like that. And I expect that would be a really great spot for chimney swifts as well. So a lot of the historic buildings that are known for chimney swifts might also be really great spots to see bats.
yeah, that's true. All right,
Can I ask something?
go for it.
It's two questions. It's about the relationship between some animals you've just mentioned. So you mentioned the pileated woodpecker. Is there some kind of symbiotic relationship where the woodpecker comes along and goes, I'll do you a nice home, and then the bat moves in? I'm not sure it's so, you know, like collegial like that, but is it, can you think of sort of pairings with bats and other creatures where they work together? But it also sounds like there might be competition with, say, the chimney swift, which does rely on cavities. So can you, the alliances and competition, can you talk a little bit about that?
I don't think it's really, as you mentioned, I don't think it's really intentional alliances. So it's kind of
Convenient.
in ecology, we use the word what was the term? Habitat architects, or
Wow.
and beavers are an architect because they are so able to change the landscape. So beavers are actually really important for bats too, because if you think in a more rural wild setting, if a beaver floods a forest and those trees die and begin to rot, that creates habitat for cavity nesters or anything that likes peeling bark. And in addition, anywhere that you have insects that are burrowing into trees. So one thing, for example, well, I haven't seen as much holes from emerald ash borer because they tend to be relatively shallow. So I don't tend to see really good pileated woodpecker holes from them, but generally any forest pest that's burrowing into the wood is helping to attract those creatures that are the architects that create the cavity habitat. So pileated woodpeckers are kind of, they're right up there with beavers on being able to create those habitats. Owls are a huge competition because they do also really enjoy pileated woodpecker holes. However, I do think that there is, I'm not sure of the specifics in terms of selecting cavities, but the smaller owl species like saw-whets and screech owls, flying squirrels, and wood ducks are all species that would use relatively similar cavities that I would be looking at for bats. So there may be some level of competition, but part of what we look for when we're looking for ideal bat habitat is a high density of cavity trees. So they have lots of choices. And they do often move roosts even through the day to select for temperature. So I do think that bats are relatively adaptable to facing those competitions.
Thank you. Really interesting.
A bit of a follow-up question for that, because in an urban forest where we just lost about a 70-year-old white pine in December, which probably, and it had a lot of pileated holes. It had some downy woodpecker holes in it as well. Might have been a good roosting tree for, for bats. What the stump is left is, it's probably at least 12 feet high. Would that still make, would that be something to leave? Because they've X'd it, and I'm thinking, well, maybe I should get in touch with forestry and say, just leave the stump the way it is, which is whatever, 12, 14 feet high. I don't know if that's the better way to do it. If not for bats, then for other species, but.
Yeah.
There is a reduced suitability for bats once the top of the tree is gone, because they are looking for something that is relatively protected from rain and the elements.
Yeah.
But there are definitely other species that could use that. So
Mhm. Yeah.
as long as it's not a safety hazard, which is
No,
of
it's
course
not.
such a
Yeah.
challenge.
Yeah, no, they already took the majority of it down, and what's left, they've still they still put an X on it, and it's like, well, you
And
put
it
the
still
X on
has
it after. Yeah, it's still up, but I mean, and
still has
hopefully they'll
lots of
just.
cavity or little
Oh
holes
yeah,
through it.
there is, and there's another white pine right behind it, which has a lot of cavities, and I think that white pine is probably going to be coming down, at some point.
Oh.
Well, it's another one that sort of, it looks like it might be at risk, so.
Yeah, we had some pretty intense windstorms over the winter that took down so many trees that it changes things
Yeah.
a little bit, but there is, of course,
Yeah.
for every tree that's lost in a windstorm, there's another tree that lost a branch that's going to start forming a nice cavity.
Mhm.
Huh.
So it's definitely worth looking at.
Mm.
I've seen some really fun habitat, like habitat tree creation projects in some different cities or in wildlife gardens. So that's always fun.
All right, well, I think that's all the questions, unless I'm missing anybody in the chat. If I am, speak up.
Up. Kidding.
But no, that was great, and I'm really looking forward to next Friday too. So
Me too.
yeah,
I'll be
hopefully
listening this weekend
hopefully
too.
it's not snowing and it's not pouring rain.
Yeah, you've whetted our appetites. Thank you.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you everyone for coming. We did record this, so I know some people had to jump in and out. So if you missed anything, we'll be getting it up onto our YouTube channel within the next week or so. But yeah, hopefully we'll see y'all next Friday in Carlington, and that is at the Morissette Gates. So that's the main gates of Carlington, Morissette Drive. And so you can Google that. I think we may have a map kicking around for somewhere. If you have real trouble, just email us and we'll give you the directions.
And wear boots. It's a little bit muddy still.
Yes, good idea. But we don't have to have bug spray at this time of year. Yay. All right. Well, thank you again very much. And we'll see you all in the parks.
Bye. Bye, everybody. Hug a tree. We don't know how long they'll be here.
Hug a tree.
Thanks, City. Bye.